Something strange just happened in China, and it's not something you'll hear about in the news. The headline is too humble to go viral, but it's much more dangerous. In January 2025, China began to raise its retirement age for the first time in 70 years. It's a sure sign that the biggest economic miracle story of the past half-century is nearing its end, and Xi only has himself and the Communist Party of China to blame. To find out where the trouble begins, just go around China and look at the people. Suppose you were able to get a representative group of the population to pose for a snapshot. Now imagine you had traveled there a decade ago and took a similar snapshot. Compare the two pictures and you'll notice something surprising. There would be a higher proportion of elderly people than there were in your 2015 picture. That's because the population here is aging. The median age in China is 39.1 years as of 2023. That doesn't sound so bad, and it's not. It's only a year older than the United States, but it's going to change fast. By 2035, the Chinese median age will be 5 years older than the United States. By 2049, when Xi hopes China will pass the U.S. as the world's most powerful country, the median Chinese person will be 51.9 years old, a full decade older than the median American. It only gets worse from there. So raising the retirement age is inevitable. Over the next 15 years, it will bump up to 63 for men and between 55 and 58 for women. The measure was controversial and took a lot of doing to pass. Unfortunately, it's just an act of kicking the can down the road. It's safe to bet that it probably won't take another 70 years before the Chinese government has to adjust its retirement age again. There are already 310 million people over the age of 60, full 22% of China's population. To put that into perspective, the U.S. population on July 1, 2025 was about 342 million, according to its Census Bureau. This ticking demographic time bomb is all due to one policy that was as destructive to China's future as anything Mao implemented. Ironically, it came from the leader who was supposed to have rescued China from the miseries of Maoism. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he presided over one of the poorest countries in the world. The Chinese economy was only 3% the size of the United States. By 2012, when Xi took over, it had grown at an average rate of 8% a year. By 2022, 770 million people had emerged from poverty. If only the Chinese leadership could sit back and enjoy such a remarkable achievement. That's not the case. Deng's regime exacted a terrible and completely unnecessary price. The year after Deng took over, China began its one-child policy. It was supposedly to limit overpopulation. Ironically, the birth rate had already been falling sharply since the early 1960s in the midst of Mao's chaos. But the one-child policy effectively stopped a resurgence that was set to take place in the 1980s. The policy was brutally carried out. Heavy fines, forced abortions and sterilizations, and even infanticide were all on the menu. But the true horror of what China did to itself goes far deeper than the headlines suggested. The one-child policy didn't just prevent births, it warped an entire society. Walk through any Chinese city today and you'll see the aftermath everywhere. There are 35 million more men than women wandering around with no hope of finding wives. That's not a typo. 35 million surplus men, roughly the entire population of Canada, with zero chance of starting families. Why? Because for decades, Chinese families practiced sex-selective abortions and infanticide on an industrial scale. When you're only allowed one child and cultural tradition demands a son to carry on the family name, baby girls become expendable. The psychological damage runs even deeper. Studies indicate that the generation of only child boys often faces behavioral issues, showing less trust, competitiveness, and conscientiousness compared to peers. An entire generation of spoiled little emperors who never learned to share, never had siblings to compete with, and now struggle to function in marriages and workplaces. But here's where it gets really dark. Millions of children simply don't exist on paper. They're called Heihaisi, black children. These are the second and third children that families hid from authorities. Kids who grow up without birth certificates, without access to schools, without any legal identity. These children are not integrated into their family's hukou, the Chinese household registration system. This hinders their access to basic needs such as medical care, education, or employment. Imagine growing up as a ghost in your own country. The geographic impact was devastating too. Rural families, desperate for sons to work the land, faced an impossible choice: follow the policy and risk having no one to carry on the family name, or violate it and face financial ruin. Civil servants and employees of government-affiliated organizations faced an even starker reality. They risked losing their jobs if they were found to have had more than one child. The Communist Party made it clear: your career or your family, pick one. Some families tried to game the system. They'd register their son with the government while keeping daughters hidden. Within the context of the one-child policy and the preference for sons in traditional Chinese society, many families reserve hukou registration for their sons, even if their daughters are older. The policy created something even more sinister: a massive human trafficking network. As many women from Myanmar cross the Chinese border, they're sold to single Chinese men desperate for wives and children. Many of the trafficked women are told that once they produce a child, they're free to go, under the condition of leaving behind their child. This isn't just about demographics, it's about the complete breakdown of social trust when a government turns families against themselves. And the cruelest irony? Much of China's fertility decline was realized prior to the launch of the one-child policy under a much less strict policy in the 1970s. China crushed millions of families for a policy they didn't even need. But it's too late for regrets. Now Beijing wishes all those people had been born. If they were around, China's aging problem would be much less severe and the pension system might not be in so much trouble. In 2019, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences issued a dire warning. If something wasn't done fast, they said, pension money might run out by 2035. China's pension program is structured along 3 pillars. The first is a basic pension for urban employees. Participation is mandatory for ordinary employees based on defined contribution rates for them and their employers. 536 million people were part of this system at the end of March 2025. But there's a loophole. Self-employed, flexibly employed, or rural workers who don't have eligible employment contracts only contribute voluntarily. So far, so good, because 535 million of them participated in this pillar of the pension system in 2025. But here's where the loopholes start to widen. The second pillar is left to the private sector. Companies create their own pension funds for employees. The third pillar is up to private individuals who can invest in financial products like insurance. Unfortunately for Beijing, participation in both of these pillars is low. The government is trying to increase awareness of these programs, but Beijing is running up against big headwinds. Once you're done taking the snapshot of China's median age, ask the younger people you come across to talk about why they might be reluctant to participate in their country's pension system. They'll tell you they aren't stupid. They know that the retirement age will inevitably need to rise higher again before they see any benefits, so the logic goes, what's the point of paying into it? But their reluctance to participate doesn't stop there. There's another reason, and it puts the Chinese government on the horns of a dilemma. If more young people participate in the pension system, it might be in better financial shape, but it might also lower the country's birth rate even further. China's young, working-age population has another frequent complaint. They're increasingly expected to take care of both children and their aging parents. Force them to pay too little into the pension system and it might collapse. Force them to pay too much and they might have even less of an incentive to have children. But the problem still gets deeper because they'll also have less money to spend on other things, and that could make things really dicey for the higher-ups in Beijing. And by dicey, we mean stopping a badly needed economic transition cold. But financial numbers alone don't capture the full crisis. Beneath the pension data lies something even more critical: trust. And that brings us to Beijing's bigger gamble. Let's turn back the clock a few months. It's December 2024 and Xi Jinping is speaking before the Central Economic Work Conference, the most important annual meeting of economic policymakers in China. He's laying out plans for nothing less than a revolution in the country's economic profile. At the conference, Xi said, efforts should be made to vigorously boost consumption, improve investment efficiency, and expand domestic demand on all fronts. In other words, his top economic priority is to turn his country into a consumer-driven economy. There's just one problem with this vision. It has no hope of success because it would require the Chinese Communist Party to turn its back on the way it runs the country. And that's exactly the kind of economic contradiction we love digging into here. If you're enjoying this deep dive, subscribing really helps this channel a lot, and we've got much more to uncover about where China's headed. Now, back to Xi's impossible challenge. Exports were the foundation for China's rapid economic miracle. They grew rapidly after Deng came to power, peaking at 35.5% of the country's total GDP in 2006, according to the World Bank. For the Communist Party, this model was perfectly adequate. It let them sell goods to the rest of the world, they and their loyalists got to keep the profits, and the economy kept growing. But this system had a flaw. It required the cooperation of foreigners who were ignorant of China's way of doing business. Exports started to decline sharply during the Great Recession. That was to be expected, but they never truly recovered to their pre-recession highs. In 2023, China exported 19.1% of its GDP. Why? When Xi came to power, he began to take a much more aggressive approach to foreign policy, and formerly optimistic trading partners began to get worried. China's behavior in the COVID-19 pandemic, when it threatened to withhold critical medical supplies, made things worse. So countries saw an increasing need to get their manufacturing out of China, and when President Trump returned to power, tariffs were at the top of his agenda. Chinese goods became much less competitive, and it's now happening much faster than Beijing can cope with. Exports to the United States dropped by 34% in May 2025. The formerly insatiable demand for cheap Chinese products is drying up as public opinion of China has soured under Xi, and trading partners begin to prioritize their security concerns. Now China doesn't have a choice. Its export-driven growth model came when people around the world were optimistically expecting it to liberalize its political system in line with its approach to trade. The world got a huge Chinese military buildup, routine intellectual property theft, and a more authoritarian China instead. One solution for its economic challenges might be for China to ease tensions with the West, but that would mean giving up on its superpower ambitions, like taking over Taiwan, and Xi can't have that. That's why he's looking at the 770 million people that came out of poverty before he took over. If they buy more stuff, China's economy can readjust. But how close is Xi to achieving his goal? The numbers tell the story, and there's good and bad news to go around. The good news is that China's National Bureau of Statistics says that in 2023, the country's GDP grew by 5.2%, and increased consumption contributed to 82.5% of the total GDP growth, 4.3 percentage points overall. The bad news, despite consumer growth, China still had a record trade surplus of almost $1 trillion in 2024. It's a sign of just how big of an obstacle Xi faces. China's explosive growth may have seen it become the world's second largest economy, but internally, it doesn't look the way that such a rich country should. Despite the emergence of its people from poverty, World Bank data shows that China's real GDP per capita was still only $12,951 in 2023. That's about twice as much as it was when Xi took over, but once again, he can't so easily celebrate his country's progress. Growth there has stalled since 2021. Remember that snapshot you took? Ask the younger people about their prospects and they'll tell you why. They'll say that these days it's hard to find a job you can rely on to provide a steadily growing income. And they're right to feel that way. Only 3 sectors are sure to provide it now. Workers in mining, information technology, or utilities companies are fine for now. Wages there are rising faster than the annual GDP growth. Everywhere else, it's a different story. The national growth rate exceeds the growth of income by workers, and since China's economic growth has only averaged 5% since 2020, low by its lofty standards, the average employee can't expect to see much growth in disposable income. And that means China's consumers will be hard-pressed to spend more money as the years press ahead. China's consumption share of total GDP was 53.4% in 2023. That's even less than it was in 2015, when it was 53.7%. Little wonder why the confidence of Chinese consumers is dropping. Reporting from the People's Bank of China clues us in on just how challenging a task Xi has in front of him. As of late 2024, 61.4% of Chinese households are clenching their wallets shut, saving instead of spending, a death knell for Xi's consumer dream. On average, Chinese citizens save 40% of their income, And when they are willing to spend money, it's not on consumer goods. Instead, it's on education and healthcare, the latter of which will inevitably grow as a portion of personal expenditures in China thanks to a rapidly aging population. Tourism was the only luxury that Chinese individuals seem to be willing to open their wallets for, but that doesn't help Xi on his quest to reduce the country's export dependency. A comparison with the United States helps to make China's long-term problems clearer. Real GDP per capita across the Pacific was $82,769 in 2023. Americans have a lot more money to go around, and they make it go around. World Bank data shows that consumer spending makes up about 70% of the overall U.S. GDP. It's a similar case in Japan, which also struggled to raise its consumer expenditures between the 1980s and 2000s. But Japan's real GDP per capita was already more than twice China's current level by 1990. And even during its so-called lost decade, consumer spending continued to grow steadily. China is starting its journey to a consumer economy in a much worse place than its Japanese neighbor thanks to its significantly lower GDP per capita and a much more elderly population than even Japan had at the time. There is a way out of the age part of that problem, at least in theory. Beijing is encouraging a so-called silver economy, where elderly people spend more to keep aggregate demand healthy. This isn't something coming out of the blue either. Elderly populations in wealthy countries have more money to spend than their younger counterparts. Unfortunately for Beijing, that solution can only be temporary at best. An elderly population also means the loss of economic productivity, and with China's pension system already in trouble, it's probably safe to bet that China can't rely on its growing cadre of senior citizens to finance a consumer golden age, at least not as much as Beijing would like them to. That's especially the case because there's something else that China lacks compared to what a normal wealthy country looks like. A silver economy can't work the same way in China as it would in the United States. Why? Because it's still a communist country. A lot of its big companies are owned by the government, so there can be no private investment. Other companies are private, but they're still deeply connected to the Communist Party. There are no 401ks or retirement savings accounts here. In the United States, elderly people can still expect to grow their money through investment income. In China, they can only rely on their savings and whatever they get from the struggling pension system. So there are only two things left that Beijing can do to make itself a consumer-driven economy. The first option is to do the unthinkable, something that hasn't happened before in modern history: go into recession. An economic contraction would allow China's economy to adjust to the new demands, but disruptively. Perhaps too disruptively. It would go against the foundational promise the Chinese Communist Party made to the country's long-suffering population. China isn't a democracy. That doesn't mean there isn't a social contract. The bargain that the party made with its people after Mao was simple. Authoritarian communist rule in Beijing would continue, but in return, the party would guarantee economic growth. So far, the party has kept its word, but not everything is so rosy lately. The party might no longer have a choice to avoid a recession. China's job market is showing signs of weakness. 16 million jobs in the country are tied to the U.S.-related exports that are now dropping fast. China is also rapidly embracing AI, but that means even more job losses and pressures on the Ministry of Finance to dish out employment-related subsidies. $9.3 billion worth of them are expected this year. People in China are deeply concerned about their country's job market, so they're not exactly going to be in a spending mood. You've probably guessed where all this is going. China is staring down the barrel of a deflationary spiral. Both consumer and producer prices are falling, and that downward trend has been there since July 2022. This is really bad news if Xi wants to transition to a consumer economy. Wait a minute. You might think that statement might not make sense. Lower prices should put a risk-averse population in more of a spending mood, right? Yes, but that's just a sugar high. To find out why, just look at one of the symbols that's shown just how much China's moved up in the world. The last time consumer prices rose by at least 1% was in February 2023. That date was probably not a coincidence. China is now the world's largest market for automobiles. Again, that's an achievement. China used to specialize in exporting cheap goods or perishables like fish. Now it's exporting advanced electric cars. But what happens when the demand for those cars abroad is under threat? The only way out for manufacturers is to sell them to people at home at lower prices. So China's car giants like BYD, Geely, and Chery started trying to undercut each other in 2023. Now China's regulators are stepping in, desperately hoping to bring the price wars to an end. Even if they're successful, they're still facing an endless string of challenges because the automotive price wars are just the highest profile instance of what's going on in the entire economy. Producers who now suddenly find themselves with an oversupply of product that isn't being shipped overseas have to lower prices to incentivize antsy Chinese consumers to make up for the shortfall. But if prices stay so long for too long, consumers will start to get even more reluctant to spend because they expect prices to go down even further. With the drop in spending comes a pullback in investment. Companies sit on cash, jobs get shed, and, well, the promise of the Chinese Communist Party gets broken. But hey, there's always the option of encouraging would-be consumers to use debt to finance their habits. China's taken that approach with its development before. All the ghost cities and roads to nowhere were one of the reasons why the economy kept growing at a rapid pace. That was when trading partners were less skeptical about Chinese exports. Debt-financed growth toward consumerism might not be easy now, especially when so many people in China are less than creditworthy. Or Xi could loosen up the regime's heavy hand and let people invest more in private enterprises. But that would mean undermining the Communist Party's control of the country, and he has no interest in that. If it means trying to sail China's aging population and slowing economy between a rock and a whirlpool, so be it. But do you think there could be another way out for Xi's China? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. It makes a difference. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.